after watching this beautiful and fascinating documentary by British film director, producer, and writer John Fleet, which I have the pleasure to introduce. John Fleet began his career in advertising, working as a creative for different brands such as Yahoo and Air France, studying cinema on the side, and making short films. Churchill and the Movie Mogul is his first documentary. Today, we are thrilled to welcome John Fleet directly from Paris. So welcome, John, and how are you? Hope everything is
Very
okay.
well, thank you, Joumana.
Okay.
I hope you can hear me.
So to kick off the talk, John, my first question to you is how did the movie come up and what has inspired you to do it? And of course, what did you discover about Churchill that you didn't know before?
Yes, great. Well, it's quite a long answer, but I'll try to make it short. I was looking for stories, actually, not for documentaries, but just for a character to write a screenplay, actually. And I was looking for interesting characters, and I saw this biography of Korda. And the front cover has a picture of him in a bowler hat, looking like a quintessential English gentleman. And yet I knew he was Hungarian. And I just initially thought he could be a good character for a story about someone an immigrant to Britain who wants to be more British than the British. And I knew nothing about Churchill's involvement in Korda's story. And then halfway through the book, I came across the fact that he employed Churchill. And I thought this could be maybe a sort of one extra character in the story as a sort of the character who inspires him would be Churchill, but it wouldn't be all about Churchill, actually. And I wrote the screenplay and I took it to some producers, and they were anxious that Churchill wasn't too much in the story, actually, and it was going to be more about Korda. And eventually I realized that the screenplay was never going to happen, actually, because the story was going to be about Korda going to Hollywood to convince the Americans to enter the war. And of course, he doesn't really achieve it in and of himself. There isn't the final scene with Roosevelt where Korda convinces Roosevelt. And so I abandoned the project, and I was going to have to completely scrap it completely. And then I thought, what if I do it as a documentary? And it was only then that I started to really bring Churchill in and thought, okay, if this becomes more about Churchill, what's the thing? And I didn't realize how involved Churchill was in screenwriting and in storytelling. And eventually the whole thing unraveled and became a sort of a story with two characters, but really it began with Korda. And then obviously what I really discovered about Churchill was that his whole life was really all about storytelling. And, you know, he had written all these books. He actually wrote more words than Shakespeare and Dickens combined in his life. So he was an extraordinarily creative person. And eventually the struggle became about telling the story without, you know, making it too much about Churchill. And in the end, the story now becomes almost like the characters are one and the same towards the end, if you see what I mean. Their interests are the same, if that makes sense.
Yes, of course. So actually, so you what was the real discovery about him, and then what you didn't know really before about him?
Well, I think it really, the reality for me is that I studied history, you know, Churchill at school. But we learn the simple story of Churchill's life, you know, and obviously the war. But if you go back through his life, there's a fascinating aspect, which is because a lot of people see Churchill as being quite old-fashioned, really. And actually he wasn't. He was very avant-garde in a way. He was always embracing new things, such as cinema, but also he was fascinated with new scientific developments and all these sort of things, which makes him quite a sort of modern character in a way, even though his politics were quite old-fashioned in a sense. And yet his politics are still extremely relevant in terms of his internationalist approach to the world. You know, this story might look like it's just about nationalism and Britain, you know, but it's not. It's about internationalism and countries working together with a shared vision. And I think Churchill's often misunderstood in that sense, you know, because he becomes the embodiment of a nationalist idea sometimes, especially in the context of Brexit, for example. He's been used for the Brexit cause, which I think is completely wrong. I don't think he would encourage that at all. So anyway, I mean, it's very hard to say what I discovered, just one thing, and there's endless things. Also, if you study Churchill, I think the thing is that his life was so diverse that he touched on so many different parts of history in the world that really you're studying life, actually. You're not just studying Churchill. I don't know when to stop talking, really. I feel like I should stop there.
So now I would like to welcome actually Hady Zaccak, the Lebanese award-winning documentary maker and professor at St. Joseph's University Film School Yezav. He is the author of more than 20 documentaries and of a book on history of Lebanese cinema published in 1997. Welcome, Hady, among us.
Thank you, Joumana.
So obsessed with history and living a fantasy life which came true, Churchill became a hero while working with Korda. My question here for you, Hady, how did Korda entice Churchill to work with him? And did Korda choose Churchill or Churchill choose Korda? I read that the word leaders at that time were obsessed in cinema. Was it a coincidence, or was it meant to be? So let us know your thoughts on that.
I think that John Fleet's film handles very well this question, especially when he talks about this relationship, and he stops on a very good example, which is the collaboration between Leni Riefenstahl and Adolf Hitler on a film, on a major spectacular propaganda documentary, which is The Triumph of the Will, and then she will continue with Olympia. So there is in the 30s this quite strong relationship between cinema used as a tool, in the case of Soviet cinema, which is also a propaganda tool, and with the Western cinema, we have also another kind of propaganda coming through fiction. So this is what we find in Korda films, and I think in the documentary we can see first of all Korda as a tycoon and as a main producer, an example of the American producers, for example, like Louis B. Mayer, or it's like a British Louis B. Mayer that has established a kingdom of cinema, London films. And there is an issue very interesting that we are also talking here about a family business, the Korda family, talking about Alexander, who is at the same time producer, director, and the general manager. We have his brother Zoltan, and we have the third, who is Vincent, and who's also a very important character in the cinema business. He is one of the most important production designers, artistic director. Did also plenty of the sets, and why I'm mentioning his name, because there is a very important work on the set in many films, such as The Thief of Baghdad, or even Lady Hamilton, with little means. But through the film also of John Fleet, I would like, and especially we are in the Middle East, to stop on three films: The Forefathers, Lady Hamilton, and The Thief of Baghdad. And the Forefathers, which was shot in Sudan, and this is something very interesting, especially at this period where they used to shoot more films in studios. So going to Sudan was something. And if you take the film and you see how much it is a patriotic, imperialist, colonialist, all combination film, talking about the grandeur, the bravery of the British, especially that there is place for cowards in Great Britain through the story of the film. And you see how Korda films the Bedouins who are anti-British, They are filmed in the same way that we see in the Western movies when they film the Indians toward the civilization coming with the white people. It's the same strategy that comes with saying that we are here as a civilized people and it is not occupation. While when you talk about Hitler or any other Western power, it becomes occupation. So this kind of Orientalism that is due to the period, we'll see it in a different way in The Thief of Baghdad, where you have here an Orient of the imagination, combined between Arabs, Indians, and Chinese. And it's not only a question of British cinema. The film was also finished in the US with the special effects coming from the US. So it is like an imagination of the Orient that the British would like or the Western would like to have, but it's now purely in the imagination, while the current Orient now has to be civilized in order to regain some of its importance. And this all comes in a period where you are dealing now with the Second World War, where you are talking about a danger on British Empire, about the occupation of the Nazis, while everything related to British occupation of the world becomes only civilization. So this is the important controversy that you can go through the film until you reach Lady Hamilton, where here the speech is more direct, especially in the dialogues of the film, and especially through the character of Nelson, who becomes somehow like an alter ego for Winston Churchill. And he talks about Bonaparte like he's talking about Hitler. So he talks that there is no place for dictatorship and to make peace. There is no place to make peace with a dictator. So talking directly in 1941 about making peace with Hitler or any kind of peace. And he knows that Great Britain is in danger. It's very interesting also to note that the film Lady Hamilton comes in 1941, while other British directors in Hollywood have started also making not propaganda films, but let me say political Nazi. One of the first, of course, Charles Chaplin with The Great Dictator, and we can add even someone like Alfred Hitchcock, who will make important films in this like Sabotage and Lifeboat, and even other European directors, especially German, like Fritz Lang with Hangman also die. So the John Fleet's documentary permits us to handle all these very complex and very interesting subjects until we reach this sentence that I find very interesting, which is governing is performance. And this makes the link between the cinema, Churchill, everyone. So I want to take the opportunity, since we have John with us, to ask him two questions. Since we are talking about performance, and since 2 years ago we had a fiction film about Churchill, which is The Darkest Hour, how did you see the representation of Churchill, since you were with the real Churchill, and now we were with Gary Oldman with a fiction version of Churchill? And the other one, what is the view now towards these films? Because, for example, for me, someone from the Middle East, Arab Lebanese, I found these films a good document about the vision of imperialism and colonialism. So they are good for me to study this vision. What about the current vision of this film in the British society today? Are they only heritage, or are they also popular films? Thank you.
Thank you, Hady. Do you mean, when you say the second question, do you mean the films you talked about, like The Four Feathers, or yes, do you mean The Darkest Hour? Okay. Yes, The Darkest Hour. Well, the thing is, because Churchill is such a well-known character, and people have seen him in archive footage a lot, it's very hard for an actor to incarnate Churchill. It's almost impossible. And I think that and in fact, that's why my screenplay, the producer wanted to have less Churchill in it, because it's so difficult to to do. And actually, I think the challenge with The Darkest Hour is that you end up watching it, but all you're watching is the performance of the actor almost, because you're sort of, it becomes more about Gary Oldman than it does about Churchill. For me, I found it very difficult to enter into the story. And in the sense, therefore, I mean, I say that also, I was pleased, therefore, that Churchill was in my film. You know, he actually is the real Churchill. But, you know, that's not to say, it's also, the thing with The Darkest Hour is it basically is suggesting that over a very short period of time, Churchill goes through a transformation, you know, which, and that the transformation was largely due to his interaction with the British people. For example, on the subway, he goes into the underground, and he supposedly transforms his view because the British people tell him they want to carry on fighting. And I find that totally unrealistic. This is a man who had been fighting for the last decade, in fact, been fighting all his life, you know, for the causes he believed in. He's not going to be convinced by other people. He is his own, you know, force of persuasion himself. So I found that just didn't really work for me. But anyway, it did very well, and also brought Churchill to the attention of a younger audience, which is really great. And it does seem that Churchill is now very much sort of in fashion, whereas, you know, I think he went out of fashion in a way, probably because a lot of people after the war had actually lived through the war, and therefore, you know, the fascination for them was different. But as another generation starts to discover it, it becomes more interesting. And also the world is obviously in a stage now where it's sort of looking for leaders. And yet, you know, and so that's where Churchill becomes interesting. But I think films like The Darkest Hour, unfortunately, are not enough. You need to look further beyond the simplistic view, obviously. And you would hope that people would then go and read the books, but I don't know. I wonder. And then, you know, in terms of the old-fashioned Corder stories and the imperialist vision, things like that, they are not. The Four Feathers actually is a wonderfully, you know, in terms of its cinematic film, it's a beautifully made film. It's almost like Lawrence of Arabia, only 20 years earlier. And there's scenes in that film that are extraordinarily beautiful. And the story is a good adventure story in a way, you know, and so it would appeal to a younger audience. The problem is nowadays, old cinema is not something that young people necessarily watch. This is my fear anyway. But they're still popular films amongst the film buffs, I would say. But of course, the vision of imperialist Britain is very unpopular, even in Britain. You know, most people now, young people, look at the British Empire and think, you know, are slightly embarrassed by it, you know, but then this has always been the English sort of thing, that we slightly ironize it. And actually, whereas someone like Corder was able to approach it differently because he wasn't British, you know, and I think that made him able to embrace it in a different way, and also embrace it because he knew that those stories were interesting to a foreign audience, like the Americans, whereas the British probably didn't realize to what degree their history was interesting, because they, you know, they were sort of closer to it. That makes sense.
Is there any question you would like to ask Hady, or shall?
Yes.
Yes, I wanted to ask a final question. What about your documentary? How much did it lead people to revisit these films, to rediscover Corda and all this heritage?
Yes, you know, that's a great question. And the thing is, my personal view is that the British are a strange nation because they don't have the same curiosity sometimes as a foreign audience. So the Americans are fascinated with British history and British films. And there's some American people I met who are much more knowledgeable about British cinema than the British. In fact, there are French people I've met who know a lot more about British cinema. So the British are a bit strange in that way, but I hope that the film, I mean, the film will have brought a bit more attention to Corder. I really hope. I get some various emails of people asking me about Korda more. So, which is great because the film really is about Korda in a lot of ways. A lot of people focus on Churchill, but really the achievement was not that Churchill told Korda exactly what to do. Korda was almost instinctively following the same politics. They understood each other, and that's a huge achievement from Korda's perspective. So but Hady, I wanted to ask you actually if there's any examples in Lebanese cinema or Middle Eastern cinema of a politician and a filmmaker in any way working together, or obviously there are political films, I imagine, but what about the politicians themselves?
Yes, there are plenty of examples. For example, if you talk about Gaddafi, the president, the leader of Libya, he produced two of the big budget films, one about the Prophet and another one, Lion of the Desert. They were made by Libyan money with the famous Syrian director. In Egyptian, and with the case also of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, he produced a film about himself,
Right.
about his debut. So he was somehow even the script writer and the main contributor for the production. And there is also a quite a relationship between cinema and the power, especially in the period of Nasser in Egypt, where there was a film by Youssef Chahine making the parallel or talking about Saladin, the great Saladin. And so it was like Nasser, the current Nasser, was the current Saladin of the Arabs in the 1960s. So there are plenty of examples where you have direct collaboration or investment. So we are talking here of the leader producing big budget films in order to talk about his role in the history of the country.
Right. I see. That sounds fascinating. Yeah. And so in a way, a form of propaganda, I suppose.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. Sorry.
So I missed that.
No, continue, please.
No, I was asking you, is it, and they were obviously a form of propaganda of sorts. I mean, manipulating history slightly to.
Yeah, absolutely.
But they're historical films, are they? Or not documentaries, but more historical?
Yes, they are the historical films, and they come, in the same period of Lawrence of Arabia. So even Lawrence of Arabia, and you said something very interesting, is like it's coming after Four Feathers in the same style. And even when Mustafa Al-Akkad decided to film, he filmed in the same sense of David Lean, while using even, he asked for Maurice Jarre to make the music. So we had like a British spirit, though the films are talking about how they are fighting colonialism and imperialism, but with the same form of David Lean films.
Okay. Yeah. And how is Lawrence of Arabia viewed? Do people think that was an accurate film in historical sense?
Well, this is very complex because I made a short documentary about this. The film was banned in the Arab world in 1963, though the crew used to come to Lebanon to spend their weekends in the St. George Hotel. But the film was banned by the Hashemite kingdom, though the Jordan gave all the help and the army and everything for David Lean, but they consider that the film is an insult to the Arabs, since it shows that it's due to Lawrence that there was an Arab revolt while they were always in dispute.
Yeah.
And so this is why it was forbidden, though there was an Egyptian actor who is Omar Sharif, who became an international star. And so the relationship became better when Dr. Zhivago was released in order to combine David Lean and Omar Sharif.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
So now I will want you to join me to welcome Joseph Bahout, the director of the Issam Faris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the AUB, where he is also an associate professor of political science. Prior to that, he used to teach Middle East politics at Sciences Po Paris. He was a researcher at the Carnegie Endowment in Washington, D.C., and he served as a consultant to the French Minister of Foreign Affairs. Welcome, Joseph, among us. We're very happy to have you. At the beginning of the movie, we read the power of cinema became a vital weapon in wartime. We saw that Churchill and Korda had a real friendship between an artist and a politician with two different worlds uniting for the same cause. Being both obsessed by storytelling and history. When Churchill did his speeches, he referenced a lot to British history. I also read that the biographer of Korda tells you, John, that he is convinced that Churchill initially gave the filmmaker the idea of making Lady Hamilton, starring Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh, in an attempt to draw parallels between Napoleon and Hitler, and hence draw the Americans into the war against Germany. So my question for you, Joe, is Joseph, is Korda could have been a politician and Churchill a movie director?
First of all, good evening, Joumana, good evening, Alice, and good evening, all of you and my colleagues on this panel. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm not very much versed in the history of cinema, but I'm definitely interested in Churchill. I love this documentary, and I'm definitely fond of politics, world politics, and local politics, as some of you may know. To answer very shortly your question, yes, definitely they could have. I mean, one could have been the other and the other way around. And the politician could have been easily a filmmaker and the filmmaker easily a politician. But I will say more than that. In fact, actually, if you follow, if you understand this film as I understood it, they were actually. I mean, Churchill was a filmmaker and an actor. And Korda became a politician, maybe despite his will or unwillingly or with time. This film is about, in fact, the encounter between two characters that were, in a way, this is what I felt, and this is my impression, between two characters that were each one of them looking for itself. I mean, for a part of itself that was a bit frustrated. Probably that Korda, because of his origins, because of his decision to migrate to the UK, to become British and etc., and also to fight a little bit the ideology that led him to leave his country, was a frustrated politician or a frustrated political activist in a way. And his encounter with Churchill gave him maybe the opportunity to express this kind of hidden envy. And definitely, and this is much easier to show and to demonstrate, definitely Churchill in the 30s and before was already a frustrated filmmaker or scriptwriter or actor and etc. And the war probably allowed him to express fully this hidden talent. This leads me to say something else. I mean, of course, it's the themes are endless in this film. We can talk about the role of storytelling, movies, culture, and this was the question before that was asked, that was raised. The role of storytelling and narrative construction in the national building, or in the national mobilization of people in times of duress. And here we can talk about other countries also, and even ours in Lebanon, because we had a cinema industry during the war, before the war, and after the war, and it played a role in the national construct in a way. But also what I think is interesting is that, and it sheds a light on the answer to your question, I think that this encounter between Korda and Churchill is also a kind of unfortunate maybe encounter between two men and history and the war. Probably without the war, without World War II, Churchill wouldn't have been the legend that we know today. Churchill was a very atypical politician until 1939. He was a kind of maverick in the British political class. He was very much fought by his peers and probably not very well known by the opinion. And he quickly understood when the war started and France fell and Britain was surrounded and Hitler was about maybe to launch the invasion of Britain, that his time has come at that moment. His time has come as a politician, of course. He takes power or he's nominated as prime minister, but also probably he understands that his time as a mega storyteller, a propagandist in chief in a way, is also come. And he turns out to become this fantastic actor, movie maker, script writer that we know during World War II. I mean, and it's very well shown in John's documentary, the way he invents a persona with his hat, his cigar, and etc., roaming into destroyed England after the German raids, lifting the morale of people, and also the entire legend that we all know about Churchill. I mean, these, these sentences that we all repeat in dinners to give the impression that we have a little bit of culture. All these sentences have been, in fact, produced during the Time War, and Churchill became really a war hero. And by the way, he disappeared right after the war. The political career of Churchill completely vanished after the war. The third observation I would make, which I think is very important to understand this film, is that this encounter between Churchill, Korda, and history and politics is typical of the 20th century. 20th century is really what we call in political history the era of mass politics, meaning mass politics in the good sense of the term, democracy, and mass politics in the very nasty, ugly, bloody sense of the term with propaganda. And both Hady and John in his film show well that this encounter between movie making, politics, and let's say historiography or the building of a national identity is not new when Korda arrives on the forefront. During the Bolshevik Revolution, the Communist Party has also invented its own storytelling with, for example, a very important movie like Le Cuirassé Potemkin and Eisenstein at that moment, that was glorifying the worker, the Soviet worker, the new man taking the assault of this ship of the Cuirassé Potemkin. And then you had the films during the Second World War. And then quickly after, if you remember, so the films during the Second World War was both the British, the American, the French also. Maréchal Pétain had its own very tiny film industry in order to create his own historiography and the narrative and the national, le récit national of occupied France, around the slogan of famille, patrie, travail, and etc. And then you had also the Russian filmmakers and the Hitlerian, the Nazi filmmaker. All this was taken to a really industrial dimension with the Hollywood of after Second World War. If you go back to the history, to the political history of Hollywood also, it's fascinating. I mean, the entire Cold War narrative, and then the entire narrative of the Vietnam War, and then the end of the Cold War and the invention of the other enemy after the Cold War, which is in fact Islamic terrorism and etc. All this has been very much enhanced by filmmaking, by the cinema industry, and by all this. All this is to say that probably the next century, the one we're entering now, the 21st century, will probably also be a century of mass politics, but very probably using other means of channeling this, other mean of constructing the national sentiment, Probably social media will play a greater role. Probably 3D and other means of communicating will take a greater role. So definitely the 20th century was the century of the encounter between big history, la grande histoire, as we say, between propaganda development, which became a political industry. And to answer your question, probably Korda today in 2021 would have been a political communicator like, I mean, many political communicators surrounding politicians today, either in Lebanon, in the Arab world, or elsewhere, and the encounter with the barbarity of the 21st century. So I think that the barbarity of 21st century wouldn't have taken this magnitude, probably, was it not, or were it not for the existence of the cinema industry at that moment. I don't know if I've answered the question, but these are the impressions or the thoughts that this very nice documentary gave to me tonight.
Thank you very much. Of course, the answer was very well and much answered, but I wanted to know if John has to add something on Joseph's, because I have some questions coming up from the participants, and so please, John, for a few minutes only.
Okay, yeah, no, I was just going to say, Joseph, I agree with you. I mean, the 21st century is going to be, I mean, it's obviously Twitter now, isn't it, that everybody uses. But I find it interesting that, you know, the way people respond to events is very simplistic, and they just state their political opinion on Twitter rather than actually trying to elaborate it into some kind of actual argument that's thought through. And obviously making a film is actually a much more elaborate way of making a point or exploring a subject. But nowadays it's just very quick. Everybody's on Twitter, and then, you know, it's a different world completely. And of course the power of media companies now is so big, you know, a movie studio, but even back in the days of Korda, the idea that MGM could basically make a movie that they would be sure would be seen by an enormous number of people, because in those days more people went to the cinema, gave them a power that almost doesn't exist today. They actually, by controlling the cinema, could control public opinion, and yet they're not a government body, and the opinions in the films that they're making are being controlled by private individuals. But nowadays it's the same thing with Fox News or anything like that. It's private. Anyway, it's a highly complex issue, and the government is not regulating it at all, really.
Thank you, John. Thank you. I have a question from Michelle. Can we talk about the difference between movies and documentaries in relation to their political impact, knowing that movies tend to romanticize and move through emotions, while documentaries might be more about true facts and thus tend more to denunciate rather than to romanticize? Or is the limit between both more complex than that, and how? I guess that the question is addressed to John, because Michelle didn't specify to whom, but I guess it's for John.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's a great question. I would say the fact is, I mean, the reality that I feel is that documentary, it's almost like there's a myth of documentary, you know, because as soon as you start to edit something together, the rhythm that you choose in the edit, or the music you choose, or the way the images are graded, you're influencing the people who are watching it. So as much as, yes, you would hope that documentary is more closer to the truth than fiction, it's never the absolute truth. I think we have to accept that. And everybody who tells a story is making a decision to exclude things from the story, and as a result, you're never getting the full story. And it is extremely difficult because history, you know, especially in the way that Korda was doing it, you know, you're doing it with the view to having a lead actor playing Nelson, you know, and the idea becomes all about him as the key figure, but it's never going to be the reality of Nelson's life. It's nothing, you know, it's not accurate at all, really. But where I do think it's interesting is that this is where Churchill and Korda had a similarity, which is that they understood that people, in order to convey a message, you need to simplify things. And Churchill understood this when he was talking to the British people. He had to simplify it into an overarching idea of some kind. And bending history and historical facts, unfortunately, that is what they had to do in order to achieve that. They could never tell history exactly as it was, because apparently Laurence Olivier wanted to make Nelson a much more nuanced character, you know, and show the darker side of Nelson. But of course, that wouldn't have been helpful at the time. So, you know, it becomes extremely complicated process. And I don't think we can say documentary is necessarily absolutely free of criticism from that sense either.
What do you think, Hady, being the documentary and movie maker, from your point of view? Please also let us know your thoughts.
Yeah, I will say that though fiction film is for the wide audience, but you know, the audience, when they watch a fiction film, they know it's fiction. So they don't believe. When they watch a documentary, they believe easily. And this is dangerous, because here we can manipulate them more and more and more by using archive material and telling them this is the truth. So in a way, I thought the documentary is much more manipulative, so has sometimes this objective approach, but it is choosing what it will give to the audience. It is giving them some key, but the audience here are less critical than when they see fiction and they say, okay, maybe, but anyway, it's a fiction. And you know, in our language, in Arabic, when you say it's nothing, it's pure cinema. So it's like cinema is a lie, while documentary is truth. And so here you can manipulate really on the boundary.
Thank you very much, Hady and John, for your great answers. So we have Sahar, who is asking actually to all three of you. So you have less than a minute to answer, each one of you, less than a minute. So where do you see the role of cinema in the current crisis that Lebanon is currently facing? So John, please, if you have
me in relation to
the role of cinema in Lebanon, if you want to start, or if Hady wants to start, or Joseph.
I'd rather if Hady starts, actually.
Okay. Okay.
Well, I see it as a continuous, when you look at the history of Lebanese cinema, we can say that Lebanese cinema has known a rebirth, or a quiet rebirth, with the Civil War in 1975. So cinema became really attached to reality, while before it was more in the music, the folklore, and the Egyptian model. So the war created a certain identity to Lebanese cinema. It finded also solutions to the dialect. You know, in the 60s, most of the films done in Lebanon were in Egyptian and not in Lebanese. They didn't talk about social and problems. This is why we were only on the postcards, and the folklore and Fairuz and Sabah. Then when you take the films that came with a new generation, which was also a very political generation, politicized generation of directors who were most of coming from the left. I mean Maroon Baghdadi, Jocelyn Saab, Randa Shahal, Burhan Alawiye. So we were dealing with a cinema that was talking about all the problems, the society, sectarianism. And until now, you know, sometimes they criticize Lebanese cinema. Why is always talking about war? And every day we discover that we haven't finished with war, and it's continuing in different forms. And so today we are in a new chapter. So, and I think it's going on with a new generation, with other generations, with other approaches. But we can say that we are still in the ongoing process that has started since 1975, especially with a film like Beirut, Ya Beirut, Baghdadi. So even today, when you look at Beirut, ya Beirut, and you want to compare it to what happened to Beirut actually after the explosion and all the problems of construction, destruction, society, poverty, you will find everything in this film. And so we are still continuing in the same process, but now with different forms, because as you can see with COVID also, cinema is not anymore only the theaters, and it's a problem actually. It's also on the social media, it's the series, it's the streaming. It's much more wide now than only the theatrical release.
So Joseph, would like to have your point of view as a political science reference. So please, your point of view, and where do you see the role of cinema in the current crisis that Lebanon is currently facing?
Yeah, I see one, but before that, maybe it's a way of answering or weighing on what have been said before. The contribution of cinema and movie making to the Lebanese quote unquote legend. I mean, to the national construct before the war. Not only, I mean, I agree with Hady, but not only it was just folklore, but I think that, for example, if you take the entire production of the Rahbani brothers, using Fayrouz and etc., be it in the theater or in the movie making, this was a huge contribution to the construction of the national myth, of Lebanon's national myth. You know, this history of the mountain, the pristine side of the Lebanese village, coexistence, the bad against the ugly, a small country resisting invaders like in Petra, for example, or others, a bit like the Kordas, let's say, legend making also. So all this was very important, but it was in a way very romanticized and very far from the realities of the social and political, let's say, existence of people day to day. The second phase of Lebanese cinema probably was much more realistic. Maybe the slight criticism that I would have towards this cinema today is that it is still a little bit prisoner of the wartime. Probably some of the best films that we still have until today are produced by the war, let's say, imaginaire, or the war imaginary in Lebanon. And there are few films that really tackle let's say, the normal, the banal side of people's lives in Lebanon, especially now that we are entering in a new phase of social duress, of difficulty of living, of etc. The relation between genders, the relation between generations in Lebanon is still a bit shyly taken or seized by the Lebanese industry of cinema. And maybe if I have to find a reason for that, I would say that also, and I would like to know or to have the opinion of Hady on that, it's probably due also to the very poor financing of our cinema. Probably today you are much more able to attract some funding in order to produce a film if it shows the big history, if it talks about the big issues, for example, the issues pending from the war or still during the war and etc. Whereby if you want to talk about very discrete phenomena happening in the Lebanese society, like, for example, something happening in the Israeli film industry or elsewhere in the Arab world and in the Middle East, you have much more difficulty to find funding or financial support in order to do so. So I would say that yes, definitely the Lebanese movie industry is promising. It is now a little bit still held by the imaginary of the war, and it is suffering from poor financing and poor means. And I think that if someone like Alice and others want to work on that, I think this is the way forward. I know of some producers in Lebanon who would really love to make films of a new kind to address new thematics in their movies, but they are really struggling with the paucity of means and encouragement.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for your answer. Now, very quickly, because we don't have much time left, John, I have two or three more questions for you, and then we'll wrap it up. How strong would you assess the impact of Korda's movies in the US in terms of shifting the national and political opinions in favor of the UK? This is a question from Lina.
Okay, great. Well, actually, I would say that it's almost impossible to measure. But, you know, in reality, I think if you travel to America, even today, just in Middle America, their knowledge of Britain or of the rest of the world is very limited. So actually, cinema, you know, in those days, people would go to the cinema like 4 times a week. It's amazing the number of people that went in those days. And so his films were distributed by a major distributor, United Artists. So basically, I would say he brought British history to the American audience. You know, before that, there was nobody else. And so, and in a way that was hugely important, because if you're American and you live in Middle America and you're going to go and fight for another country or for Europe, you know, you need to understand who those people are a bit more. And I think that it was hugely important. But of course, you know, in reality, I don't really know the exact influence. Of course, there was a lot of anti-British sentiment that needed to be reversed. So cinema was one way of doing that.
Thank you, John. So I have a question who is coming from an ad person like you. Odile is asking you, how do you judge this Churchill Korda project as a next advertising man? Is it the ultimate ad campaign?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as a branding campaign, it's very effective. I mean, you know, cinema has a special hold over people, and it really does, you know, take you off into a different world. And I think, you know, there's nothing quite like it, really. And if people don't know that they're being influenced, then, you know, it's a subconscious influence, really. Then that's even better. So yeah, absolutely. I can't hear you.
You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Yes. Last question is for you, John, as well. Do you see that soft power tools such as cinema, music, sports are still valid in today's political dynamics, especially that social media can be a platform for all these tools? Or should we expect something else to take their place, like smart power?
This question is maybe for Joseph.
Yeah.
Sorry, for Joseph. Yes, I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I addressed part of it when I said that probably the 21st century will be a century where narrative and political narrative and national construction will revolve around the new means of communication, Twitter, Facebook, TokTok, and etc. I mean, let's not forget that we are now waving farewell and goodbye to an American president that almost exclusively governed the US from his Twitter account. I mean, this is something one day we will have to reflect on. Now, of course, a Twitter account or a Twitter feed doesn't have the power of movies and the cinema, as John said, and as Hady also said. So probably we'll have other means of communication. Now, I would very briefly, I mean, maybe conclude by saying that let's also be cautious about this maybe too frequent use that we make of the concept of soft power. Not everything that is not a weapon is soft power. Sometimes it's only communication and etc. Now, talking about soft powers, yes, soft power, yes, definitely. Today, probably the means of soft power for countries like Turkey, like the Gulf states, like maybe other countries outside the Middle East are the TV series that are today conveying a way of life or a culture. They could be also social media and etc. But I agree also that, and this is maybe a kind of greeting and salute to the cinema, This doesn't mean also that cinema and movies have completely vanished from the tools and the toolkit of propaganda impacting the imaginary and etc. And this is a way to say that cinema still has some bright days ahead, and I think that other tools will not very necessarily demote cinema like a Kindle tablet did not demote the book or the newspaper.
Thank you, Joseph, for your answer. I have a last one for John that time. Do you think a partnership like Churchill Corda's can be effective nowadays?
Well, no, that's a very good question. Yeah, I don't think so. Probably not. I mean, I think, they definitely existed in their time. I don't know if Churchill would have the same success as a politician nowadays. It's just, yeah, a different time, really. I'm trying to think of an example of a modern day politician and a filmmaker. And there isn't one really. The Olympic ceremony in Britain was orchestrated by Danny Boyle, who's a British film director, and he was asked to sort of depict Britain in a way for the opening ceremony, and so it's a form of visual sort of branding, but it wasn't a film; it was a sort of a theatrical show. No, I think, yeah, it's a different time, and in those days, politicians and filmmakers, I think they did mix more easily, perhaps. There was a sort of different social scene. Nowadays, also, people don't even meet up nowadays, everything's over email and it's all very impersonal. So
thank you very much, John. I have a last question for you. Actually, wanted to know how long did you take to do the movie, and this is from our side. We're asking you, and what are your next projects? This is very important. What would you do after this beautiful and huge documentary? What are your next projects?
Yes, well, that's very kind of you to ask. I actually can't tell you is the answer, because it's too soon to tell you the idea for my next film. But actually, this one took me quite a long time because it's my first film, so I'd done short films before, but, I was learning on the job and I wrote the screenplay first. So it took me 4 years, basically, from start to finish. And it could have been a disaster, and so the fact is that I'm so delighted that you enjoyed it, and that it found an audience in lots of parts of the world. And so I'm really grateful for your curiosity about it. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Is this the last question from Chiara? No, just this is a comment, no question. Anyone has a question before we wrap up? And then we thank you very much for attending and for your presence and enthusiasm. And thank you, Alice, for making it happen, of course. And so I guess the next reunion and rencontre will be announced very soon, with Alice's dynamism and enthusiasm to let BAFF continue in 2021.
Sure. Thank you, John. Thank you, Joumana, Joseph, and Hady. Thank you, everybody. And see you next month on a Sunday evening with an amazing long film. I won't say anymore. I'm trying to organize a special discussion about it. Also on cinema. Stay safe and have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.